So in the last class, we talked about Isaac and Abraham and all the sacrifices. And we also talked about the idea of substitutionary atonement. Is the idea that somebody dies in place of the guilty. So an innocent party is killed and dies in place of a guilty party. And so instead of the guilty person dying, there is a substitute. Hence, we call it substitutionary atonement. All right, so we want to go to the next session here. And it's a session where we talk about Jacob and Esau. And Jacob and Esau are Isaac's children, and therefore making them the grandbabies of the grandchildren of Abraham. Isaac and Rebekah get pregnant, and they have twin boys growing in Rebekah's womb. And so Rebekah has a very difficult pregnancy. And so like any praying woman, she goes to God and asks God what is going on. So if you look at Genesis chapter 25, verse 22, the babies jostled each other within her. And she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. Then God answers her. And this is a very famous piece of scripture that I want you to really remember. Verse 23, the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two people from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." And so we know the story that the older was Esau and the younger was Jacob. So the promise that God gives Rebekah here is the promise of his grace once again. Because remember, Rebekah and Isaac are living in a culture where if you have children, the older child gets double blessing, and the other children, they get just normal blessings. So here you are in a place where the younger child is going to be stronger and is going to rule over the older child. So and these two boys are very, very interesting and very different. So Esau is this macho man that goes out to hunt for wild animals, and Jacob is what we will call today mama's boy. So he is sitting at home with the mother, they are cooking, and the mother loved Jacob, and Isaac loved Esau. Rebekah eavesdropped on a conversation that Jacob has with Isaac. His father is old, is blind, and is dying. And so he wants, before he dies, to bless his children. So he tells Esau to go and kill an animal and make him dinner. And so Esau goes out to go hunt, as the father has requested. Now, while this conversation is going on, Rebekah hears it. So Rebekah goes to Jacob and says, "Your father wants to bless your older brother. So why don't you disguise yourself with wool?" Because Esau was very hairy and he smelled like the game, like kind of like if you are a herds boy, you're gonna smell like the cow. So Esau smelled like the wild animals. So Rebekah disguises Jacob nicely and then kills an animal and cooks that animal for Isaac. So Jacob takes the food to Isaac, and Isaac suspects that there's something going on that is not normal. So he asks these inquiry questions, and Jacob passes as Esau. And so Isaac eats the food and then gives the firstborn blessing to Jacob, the younger brother. So his brother comes back, discovers what has happened, and is very angry and wants to kill Jacob. Remember, previous to this, Esau had already sold his birthright. Remember one day when he came back from hunting and he's very hungry, and Jacob is making a meal, and he says, "Give me the meal I want to eat." And Jacob said, "I'll give you a meal, but in exchange of the meal, I want the rights of the firstborn child." And Esau, very hungry, doesn't think about what he's doing, so gives the birthright to Jacob. So now, legally, Jacob is the firstborn, and Esau is the secondborn, because of this bowl of soup, Esau has sold his birthright to his younger brother Jacob. So Jacob, in fear of his life, runs away. And while he's on the run, he goes to his uncle called Laban. And you're going to see something interesting about this family. But now, before even we go to Laban, I want to bring something to your attention. And this is the idea of that Jacob had already been blessed by God. He did not have to go and steal the birthright from his brother Esau because it was already his. So this act was unnecessary because God had already promised that he will become the dominant nation. But it seems that there is a theme about Abraham's family here in them trying to help God do his work. So many years pass and the child is not coming. So Sarah becomes very creative and says, here is my servant Hagar. Abraham, please sleep with her. So Abraham sleeps with her and Ishmael is born. And there is this big rivalry between the two women. And Sarah even kicks Hagar out of the home, And so we see this theme recurring of just a dysfunctional family of Abraham and his descendants. You look at Abraham. He goes to this town, and then he lies that Sarah is his sister. Guess who does the same thing? Isaac. Then Isaac wants to bless Esau against the will of God. But then Rebekah is over here lying, helping Jacob to lie to Isaac. And so Jacob goes and stays with his uncle Laban, running away from his brother. While he's there, he falls in love with one of his cousins. Apparently, that was allowed those days. So Rachel is a beautiful girl. Jacob falls in love with Rachel. Then Laban tells Jacob, if you want to marry Rachel, you have to work for me for 7 years, and that will be kind of your dowry price, and you're going to get this girl. So Jacob works hard, and he gets to 7 years, and he goes to his uncle and say, okay, can you give me Rachel to marry? So they do this big ceremony, and then during the honeymoon night, instead of giving Jacob Rachel, he gives him the other sister called Leah. So Jacob goes to bed with this woman and then wakes up in the morning and behold, it was Leah. So he goes back to his uncle and he complains, and then the uncle said, well, for you to get Rachel, you have to work for me for another 7 years. So he works for these two women for 14 years. Rachel doesn't have children, but Leah gets children. And so through a series of events, Jacob gets all these children through Leah and the maid servants of Leah and the maid servants of Rachel, and eventually Rachel gets pregnant and gives birth to a child, and we're going to talk about this child later. His name is Joseph. So it seemed like this family had a problem with deception. So you look at this, and the story of Leah and Rachel shows the deception of Jacob, Laban, Leah, and even Rachel herself. Then Jacob flees from Laban and takes a bunch of animals with him to go meet his brother Esau many years later. And so he has a plan to go there and apologize to Esau. But on the way there, he wrestles with God, and God actually wins. And at that point, his name is changed from Jacob to Israel. So here's a good exercise for you guys. Can you, as a class, take a pause right now, or if you're watching this alone, take a pause right now and do a research and find out what the meaning of Israel is. Why did God call Jacob Israel? And then figure out what is the meaning of Jacob and what is the meaning of Israel, and what is the significance of God changing the name of Jacob. And we're going to see this recurring theme in the Bible. When God calls somebody, he's going to change their name. Abram is changed to Abraham, and Sarai, her name is changed to Sarah. Jacob, his name is changed to Israel. And even in the New Testament, you see Jesus changing the name of Peter from Cephas to Peter, Petros, the rock. That is the story of Esau and Jacob. Before we take a break, I want to just point out something here. Have you ever noticed how hard it is to find an example of what would be called a healthy family in the Bible? Like, you would think that Abraham, who's the father of all nations, when you look at his family, maybe God chose him because his family was perfect. But that is contrary to what goes on in the Bible. So when you look into the Bible, it is very easy to find a family that has a lot of sin, a lot of pain, than we find families that are what we call normal. For example, just looking at the family of Abraham, and I'm going to go through this, and I want you to look at this and remember that this is a sinful man. In the other class, we talked about how Abraham was an idol worshiper, like he worshipped idols. And here we are right now, and Abraham is chosen by God, and we think because he's changed that everything is perfect. Abraham's family, we see Sarah grieving over her infertility, and then moves to give her husband the servant girl Hagar, as we talked about previously. And then so Hagar in chapter 16 happens to be pregnant and gives birth to Ishmael. So when it happens that Sarah cannot have children still, and Abraham is growing in love with his baby Ishmael, and Sarah gets really angry and jealous. During all this time, Abraham is standing there very passive about the whole affair. Lot is Abraham's nephew. Lot goes to a place called Sodom, a very perverse place, and he makes that place his home. And then, but when the time comes that God says, I want to destroy this place, God had to forcibly drag Lot out of Sodom before he destroyed it. And then weeks later, after his wife turns into salt and is there with his daughters, and his daughters get him drunk and then sleeps with him, and then through that incestuous relationship, they have children. And then comes Isaac and Rebekah. They play favorite with their twin boys, whose sibling rivalry become one of the worst rivalry in the history of Israel. And we see this in Genesis 25. And then Esau has no discernment. He sells his birthright for soup in Genesis 25, grieves his parents by marrying Canaanite women, Genesis 26, and then nurses a 20-year murderous grudge against his conniving younger brother, Jacob. Jacob, the said conniver, manipulates and deceives his brother out of his birthright in Genesis 25, and then blessings in Genesis 27. And then Uncle Laban comes in the picture, deceives his nephew Jacob by smuggling Leah in as Jacob's bride instead of Rachel in Genesis 29. And then this results in Jacob marrying sisters. A horrible situation. Now, again, another simple exercise. Can you guys, or if you're watching this alone, just go and read Leviticus 18:18. Stop right now and read Leviticus 18:18 and jot some things down why it was very wrong for Jacob to end up marrying these sisters. And so out of this mess of a relationship in this family comes out 12 sons in Genesis chapter 30. So they have a neighboring community of Shechemites, so people from Shechem. They abduct Jacob's daughter Dinah and Repsa, and then they go and they say, we want to marry her. Levi and Simeon respond by saying, if you want to marry our sister, you all have to be circumcised. Circumcise all the men of Shechem. So while these guys are healing from this circumcision, Simon and Levi go out and kills every man in Shechem in Genesis chapter 34. And Jacob's oldest son, Reuben, can't resist his incestuous desire and sleeps with his father's concubine, the mother of his brother, in Genesis chapter 35. And so this year he just keeps on going and going, and his family is a mess, you know. And then we continue. 10 of Jacob's sons contemplate in selling their brother, Joseph, into slavery. And then they lie about it to their father for 22 years until Jacob exposes them in Genesis 37 and Genesis 45. Okay? You can read that story there. Then Judah, as a widower, frequented prostitutes, and his daughter-in-law Tamar knew about this. To revenge for her not being given a son after two of her husbands die, disguises herself as one of the prostitutes and then sleeps with her father-in-law. And through this, she gets pregnant and gives birth to two sons. You begin to look at this, and it is on and on and on. And so I was thinking about this and say, why is God using such messed up people to bring about his will of redemption in the world? Why is the Bible loud on sinfully dysfunctional families and quiet on harmonious ones? Well, for one thing, most families are not harmonious. Think about your own family. Humanity is not harmonious. We are alienated from God and from each other. That is one of the things that happened when Adam fell. We broke from perfect relationship both with God and with each other. So when you put alienated, selfish sinners together in a home, sharing possessions and the most intimate aspect of life, having different personalities and interests and a desperate distribution of power, abilities and opportunities, and you have a recipe for sin or sin mess. But there's a deeper purpose at work in this. The Bible's main theme is God's gracious plan to redeem needy sinners. It teaches us that what God wants most for us is that we become aware of our sinfulness. 2, that we become aware of our powerlessness to save ourselves. And 3, to believe and love his son, Jesus Christ, and the gospel that he preached. And then 4, to graciously, after we have fallen in love with Jesus and he with us, to love one another. And it turns out that the family is an ideal place for all these to occur. Because think about it. No matter how much you don't like your family, they remain to be your family. And somehow, dysfunctional families, people always have a way to come around what is happening within them and fix their messes. But what we often fail to remember is that the mess is usually required for these things to occur. Sin must be seen and powerlessness must be experienced before we really turn to Jesus and embrace his gospel. Because unless you see yourself as a sinner and your powerlessness to save yourself, you will never turn to God for salvation. The reason why you and I are saved today is because one day we confessed that we are sinners, and then we realized our own inability and powerlessness to save ourselves. And then we went to Jesus and said, please save me. And before we can really turn to Jesus honestly and embrace this gospel, sin must be exposed and powerlessness must be experienced. Hope that is clear. Maybe after this lecture, you can sit around and discuss the implications of why it is so important for people to realize that they're sinners and their powerlessness to save themselves. If gracious love is to be demonstrated, then sin must be committed. You can't understand and appreciate the depth of God's gracious love until you commit sin, until you're a sinner, and you begin to understand that even in your sinfulness, God still loves you. As you look at this family, be encouraged that no matter how messed up you are, God can still use you. So let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to be on page 12 of our books, looking at the book of Exodus. So I want you to get your books and read page 12 and page 13 and 14. And then we're going to look at it next in the next class. Okay? All right.